Hi everybody, thanks for checking out G4G here on YouTube. Today's background soundtrack is brought to you by the Dead Space 3 OST because it's spooky, it's scary, and in today's video we get to talk about the top 5 all-time spooky scary skeletons, infiltrators here within Marvel Avengers Alliance. So, let's jump right into it. Now, this one actually wound up being a little bit tougher than I thought it would be. I kind of thought, there's not going to be that many, like, super good infiltrators for this. And I started going through the list, and I had them set up, and I had my honorable mentions. And then I actually had to, like, flip-flop a couple times, and I'm looking at the list, and I'm like, wow, I have a lot of ground to cover here. And it surprisingly was bigger than I thought it would be, but let's jump into it. So the first one that we need to talk about is Infiltrator Invisible Woman. The single biggest reason for quite some time that shield breaker was necessary. She was actually successfully teamed up with Molly back when Molly came of age for people in terms of levels. Invisible Woman kept Molly clean of debuffs so that she could go into her tantrum and wreck your team. Invisible Woman is making a little bit of a resurgence thanks to all the debuffs and the nerf to magic warding and everything like that. And she also has a very, very high innate dodge proc. Throughout the history of this character being around in her white suit, the Future Foundation suit, she has been a strong infiltrator in PvP. She also has the ability to have a lot of sustain. She's not going anywhere. She's pretty simple on defense. If she gets attacked, she's going to put shields up. The shields are going to clean debuffs unless Pesty is around. Or the Scroll of Runemeroth. Or Pesty's effect is applied through the ISO. Future Foundation Invisible Woman is just one of those infiltrators that really can't go anywhere. And now that all scrappers can activate their abilities regardless of an infiltrator being out there in the world, infiltrators are definitely in a higher power position now than they ever were, since it's no longer a super bad risk to take infiltrators into battle with you. So the next infiltrator is actually going to be one of our newest, and it is the worthy of Davian Hellstrom known as Angrier. Now, Angrier is definitely existing in both his blaster and his infiltrator form currently. The infiltrator form can make very solid use of the covert ISO, because if he does that, he's going to be countering with Soulbreaker on people, which can be particularly nasty. While you may say Angrier could possibly be too new to really appear on a countdown like this, let's face it, Angrier is in the meta. He's in the meta enough that he actually needed to take a bit of a nerf. With the ability to remove class buffs from people, put out Doom, give his whole team stealthy, which nothing really else can do that. The rapid fire summons, the big twisted flames heal. Yeah. The fact that he can feed null meteor stacks and everything. Angrier is definitely a powerhouse in the infiltrator class. It's a fairly even split as to whether or not people run him with blaster or infiltrator. They each have their own benefits, but he shows up with enough frequency in the infiltrator class to be counted. So we now have our first honorable mention, and it is going to be Nightcrawler, especially Nightcrawler with his Pious Prayer, aka the Mystic Shroud ISO. So it used to be this one was super hard to get, now the game kind of throws it at you fairly frequently. Nightcrawler with the Pious Prayer ISO was really, really tough to deal with because it was a Mystic Shroud in the first round if you didn't have the Mystic. Also, he was capable of putting up really, really solid numbers especially considering it's his level 1 that's the Paragon Exploiter, and the Combo Exploiter, and the Hemorrhaging Attack, and the 60% chance to follow up with an ambush. So, triple threat, and then actually Shadow Dance is what it was, into a second round ambush was often quite obnoxious. Also, Shadow Dance triple threat and then an ambush was pretty ridiculous. He's out of the meta now and nobody really uses him, but if you go back for a certain time, also with his tanking ability with Noble Sacrifice, and his, believe it or not, it was higher than 20%, his high chance to poof away in a whiff of brimstone, he really was an obnoxious character for Infiltrators back in the day, until Quicksilver ran him out of town. He is an honorable mention now, only because I basically decided that one other Infiltrator that I had as an honorable mention, I really needed to move into the top 5, and that is the original Psylocke. Psylocke was a huge initiator for the original heavy follow-up teams and extra attack teams. She got super better when her mental prep came out. Not that it really mattered because the AI tended to use the stupid kinetic shield in random points anyway. But even though the AI sometimes flubbed her kinetic shield usage, Psylocke as just a passive buff stick out on the field was a force to be reckoned with. She does huge damage on her psychic knives, and her mental coordination that is easily refreshed was a big deal for her. Later on, she got a little bit of competition from the X-Force suit, which says that she is permanently stealthy, and so is other X-Force people. Nowadays, modern Psylocke is capable of being stealthy all the time anyway, thanks to level 15 activating combat reflexes. But Psylocke is still in the meta today with groups like Spitfire and Star-Lord and Quicksilver. She's there. She could be used quite effectively. Also, considering we have a offensively tilted armory item, even though it is pretty out of date at this point, it is entirely possible to see the continuation of Psylocke-based teams. Not only does she have a very, very solid E-ISO, she also has a solid A-ISO that turns her level 1 into a quick action. That means you can basically make the Infiltrator version almost like a snappy service tactician. Instead of doing the mental coordination as a quick action, like the tactician would, the telekinetic katana is used as a quick action, and then you go into the mental coordination. Pretty smart. Up next, and on the same page, is going to be Infiltrator Emma. Now, Emma, as we all know, existed as a tactician in her stock cleavage outfit over here. However, when some enterprising individuals realized the power of the covert ISO along with Phoenix 5 Infiltrator Emma, she rose back up to massive fame. Emma definitely enjoyed a strong power position back in the early days of PvP, but then eventually just kind of fell out a little bit. She took some nerfs along the way, and a few things happened. Then she came rip-roaring back for several seasons thanks to the covert ISO, allowing her to pre-apply Psychic Tap. It literally made it so that she was a woman scorned. You just didn't want to fuck with this woman. Similar to the succubi that will almost wipe your entire group if you play with them. If you thought Emma was going to detect you, you were extremely gun-shy and you just couldn't take an attack. Considering you couldn't make her off balance, the nightmare was absolutely doubled. You needed stealth to walk around her or generalize her and just remove it from the equation. Fortunately, Playdon realized, hey, this is a little bit too strong, and said Psychic Tap will not proc on the turn that it's applied, if it's done as a pre-counter. And this is actually true of the idiot dinos that do it too. So she's been knocked back to the kitchen. You get it? 'Cause, yeah. But Emma Frost definitely enjoyed a very big resurgence in PvP to the point where people had to design teams around Emma. People had to design teams around Pesty back in the day, and then suddenly we were designing teams around Emma with the techno-organic endoskeleton and things like the experiment, because the lunacy was also super popular. We also first started seeing the usage of despair because she was often with P5 Colossus, who gave the team massive healing capabilities. So she has gaps in her power, but she definitely spiked until she was nerfed. Coming up next, we'll deal with the next honorable mention. We just briefly talked about him. It's going to be Pesty. Now, you might say, dude, Nagbum, Pesty clearly wins hands down as a tactician, and I would say you're right. However, thanks to the Elite ISO and the Covert ISO, with the Elite ISO on Agents and the Covert ISO on the Infiltrator form of Pesty, all of a sudden the Infiltrator form of Pesty became powerful. Very powerful. Much like Emma, he has a dangerous level 1 that you absolutely want to avoid if possible. And that's generalized with a cloudy chance of nanoplague. Yeah, really vicious thing to be hit with, especially as a pre-counter. Considering Pesty's passives, this isn't something you really wanted to get hit with. So while he does largely exist in the meta as his tactical form, recently he deserves an honorable mention because of what the Covert ISO has done to his Infiltrator form. Moving on, we have dealt with Invisible Woman, Angrier, Psylocke, and Emma. We have dealt with some honorable mentions in Pesty and Nightcrawler. We are going to hit the final Infiltrator of the top 5, and then we will deal with 2 more honorable mentions. So, unlike Pesty, this Infiltrator has always existed as an Infiltrator, and is one of the most obnoxious Infiltrators in PvP of all time, especially when teamed up with her debuff sealing friend in Pesty, the one, the only, Amora, the Enchantress. Sister of Lorelei, Enchantress is an absolute twat to deal with when debuffs are forced to be on. Enchantress was quite laughable when she first arrived. It's like, I'm just going to keep cleaning your stuff. There's nothing you can do. But then, Pesty happened. And Pesty, when combined with Enchantress, turns her into an absolute twat burger. Now, she should be going extremely well with Null, but most people don't think to use Null with Enchantress to stack meter swarms. It's a combination that's out there a little bit, but it doesn't happen too much. The biggest reason being is everybody thinks, well, I need to seal in her debuffs. I gotta run Pesty. I'm a fucking genius. Well, guess what? There's the Scroll of Runemeroth, and now we have an ISO that says you can do what Pesty does and not suffer all the negativity of having a Pesty round. And thanks to the fact that the debuff portions of her kit are not going to get popped by the Deb anymore because they're subtle, unless you're running the Lunacy, Enchantress can actually become her own Pesty. She can become her own Despair. The only thing is, they're single target. So, why not have Null do the Pesty related thing for the manipulated, and then have her run Despair on these? Ta-da! You have a real douche knob team, but people don't think that way. Or if you have the Scroll of Runemeroth, give Despair to all of them. Put Despair on Null. Nobody's healing for a century. You get a Despair, You get a despair. Everybody gets a despair. Look under your seats. Your life is going away. Enchantress has a vicious Emerald Wave hit. Her exploit Attrition and her exploit Delirium are really big, and Delirium could potentially be extremely popular now, thanks to the lunacy and people like Cloak and Dagger. You could probably make an extremely good Enchantress and Cloak and Dagger fight, especially if you have the Scroll of Rudimoroth, sealing in those debuffs. Enchantress, however, does suffer one negative drawback, and the fact that she just can't take a punch to the face very well. I honestly have found Enchantress to be one of the squishiest people of all time. When my Archangel and Psylocke, both in their X-Force uniforms, would encounter an Enchantress, she would typically melt, especially if Archangel would get a chance to do his Scrapper benefit on Enchantress. You have to protect her, but if she is protected properly and has good synergy with her teammates, Enchantress has definitely earned a spot in the top 5 Infiltrators of all time. So, let's move on to the final honorable mentions. We gotta throw a nod into Victor for the Beta Ray build team-ups and everything. We gotta throw him a nod also because he's going fairly well with Winter Soldier, Beta Ray Bill, and now potentially even Electro and Jane Thor. Victor is fairly solid and enjoyed a high degree of popularity right from his start. His ability to reboot was something that needed to be nerfed, and Playdom did come out and actually do it. It was not unheard of to have a 20-30 minute match with an eternally living Victor because he just wouldn't die. Moving on from there, we have a long-forgotten Infiltrator in Spider-Man. Spider-Man was an Infiltrator in his default kit. A lot of people forget it because they tend to move him over to a Scrapper or a Bruiser fairly early on, and fairly commonly. However, he existed as an Infiltrator in his classic outfit, and he also had a Infiltrator Future Foundation suit. This Future Foundation suit was extremely big back in the day. He would often protect people like Nightcrawler, and he ramped up after a few rounds of being on the field because of the white suit. Couple him with Invisible Woman, and you had a very, very tough team to take down. People have forgotten about him now, but he was pretty strong back in the day and deserves an honorable mention. And finally, just because I had to throw Victor in, which offset things by a little bit, we do have to give an honorable mention to Hogun's Warrior 3 counterpart, who definitely is going to be considered an Infiltrator because that's the ISOs he can wear, Fandral. Fandral is one of the few early on split classers and one of the few people with D-Power early on aside from Spiral. His D-Power was obnoxious as hell. He would do on guard and he would D-Power people for an entire round. Not only that, you felt so good that you finally cleaned off the bleeds that he put out. It was like taking that big dump that was building up in your bowels for 6 hours. You finally get relief, you finally clear yourself off, and what does he do? He drops another fucking Flaming Circus on you, and you have another 3 stacks of bleeds, and you are just like a gazelle in the jaws of a fucking lion. You were just going to die and bleed out. And then if somebody procs his Elixir of Recovery, you're like, well, he's back up to full and has no debuffs. Fuck me running. Fandral was an extremely obnoxious Infiltrator for quite some time. He's smoothed out now, and he's not really that popular anymore. And the Warriors 3 is just kind of gone by the wayside. But he's somebody who's always poised to make a decent comeback now that Despair is pretty good, and there's definitely more than one way of sealing in your debuffs. We may never see him again, but it is certainly a possibility. Unfortunately, his D-Power took a massive nerf when all D-Powers took a nerf several months ago. So there you go, guys. There is the top 5 infiltrators in PvP of all time. They are Invisible Woman, Angrier, Psylocke, Emma, and Enchantress. We're going to throw some honorable mentions to Fandral, Nightcrawler, Pesty in the Infiltrator set, Spider-Man, and our boy Victor. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Take care.